The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in
Hello, everyone.
listen-only mode.
This is Bill Wolf. I hope this finds you all doing well. Before we introduce Mr. Yates here, we're going to go over some past community past community news. I can speak, so um, if I have problems here, that's not fun. There we go. So first of all, we want to make sure that you know that Summit is quickly approaching. I can guarantee you it will change your career. So you might, if you can attend, talk your boss into it, and definitely make sure you're there. Since you are part of the DevOps virtual user group, you can save $150 for the conference. Right here is the user code. Oops, sorry. Right there is the user code. So if you want to screenshot that, VG Dish VHK, and I can also send it out as part of an email blast, and that way you guys can have that discount code. Uh, we do want you guys to get involved in the community as a speakers. I know myself, I started back in 2013, and I can tell you even just doing that is phenomenal. You can read Kathy Kellenberger's blog. We call her Aunt Kathy. She's the co-leader of the WIT group, and on the past blog, you can go there and she can help teach you about being a new speaker. And the way I look at it is mostly just be yourself and share what you've learned in your career. There's other ways you can help support PASS. If you know a company that can sponsor either a virtual user group or a local user group, then you can get a $100 gift card for referring that sponsor. You can email Catherine.allen@pass.org if you have anything like that. And if you don't remember that, you can always contact me. PASS itself is hiring. So if you have any interest in working for PASS itself, go to pass.org/careers. So upcoming virtual group webinars, we have, well, let's see, some of those are in the past. So let's see what we've got here. We have application development coming up on the 28th. And then that's with Jeff Garbus. We have Tim Radney. He's going to be introducing SQL managed instances. I've actually seen that session already on the 11th. And then we have Ronan. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. He's talking about lowering expenses by using Azure Elastic Pools and Azure Elastic Jobs. So that should be a really good one. I'm interested in myself. And then we have the DBA Fundamentals for John Martin. SQL Saturday Night, that looks like a good one. Power BI. And Tracy, Intro to Query Store. Tracy is a fellow Idea Ace. A very good person, so she does a good session on Intro to Query Store for the Women in Technology group. So lots of good free learning, and these are all virtual. You don't have to leave your office or your home or wherever you're at. So again, we have many virtual groups. You can take a look at them all here, and you can also go to pass.org and find them as well. Upcoming SQL Saturdays, we have, as you can see, in the U.S. and Canada, Houston, Iowa, Louisville, so on and so forth. And then throughout the country, in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, we have Melbourne and Sydney. We have in Europe, we have Athens and Paris and Manchester. And then even in Latin America, we have one as well coming up. I know that Mr. Yates and myself will both be in Louisville on July 21st. So looking forward to that.
And a quick note, I will be, oh man, I hope that his thing isn't muted. Okay, cool. I will be presenting in Paris about PowerShell and simplifying extended events management if any of you guys are in the Paris area.
Right. So, and I apologize, Chrissy, I hadn't yet introduced you, but yeah, we're here with
no problem.
Chrissy Lemaire is here as well. She's a co-organizer for this group, and absolutely, if you're going to be in Paris, she is unparalleled. I would highly recommend it if you're in Europe and you can have a chance to go see her, go see Alex, anytime you get a chance to. So.
Hey, Alex, will you be? Oh, I need to unmute him. Alex, are you going to be at the Paris SQL Saturday?
I'm afraid I'm not going to be in Paris. I'm going to be in Manchester. I'm going to be in
Oh, cool.
SQL GLA. You're going to GLA, aren't you?
Which one?
Glasgow.
Yes. Oh my God, I'm super excited about that one. Yeah, totally going to be in Glasgow.
Awesome. All right. And then, like we said, you're just being part of this virtual group. You are part of PASS. Meetups, events, conferences. Go to your local user groups. Go to these. Your local user groups, a lot of times you can go, and if you're lucky enough, they'll even serve beer and pizza. If not, you're going to get some free learning anyway, so it's all worth it. So connect with us. Twitter is very heavily used in the PASS community. Hashtag SQL Help, hashtag SQL Pass. Very useful tools. So I am going to hand this over to Alex here in just a second. And he will be able to take it from there. So Mr. Alex Yates is he's a DevOps specialist here, and we're going to give you over to him, and I'll let him introduce himself and go from there.
Hi, how's it going? How do I share my screen now? Share screen. Which one do I want to share?
You're showing your PowerPoint, but not in presenter mode. Now we just see a big picture of you.
Woo!
Look at those MVP. Look at those
me.
MVP things in the wall there. Nice.
Yeah. No, I'm apparently not. You're not seeing my. You're not seeing my monitor with the.
There we go. Now we're seeing the monitor.
Good. Now I'm not muted. Fantastic. Hi.
That was my fault. My apologies.
Chrissy. Hi, so I'm Alex, and I'm going to talk to you about data breaches. Data protection is something I care about. I think it's important, and it's something that I think that as an industry we've not taken seriously for a while. And now we're being penalized by a whole bunch of regulations that have come in to try and force us to take it seriously. And I think it's quite important for various different reasons, apart from the fact, well, all the obvious reasons. Probably most of us on the line have been affected by one or two of the data breaches that I've listed on the website in front of you. Hopefully, I'm talking about the LinkedIn and Dropbox ones, because they affected a huge number of people, as opposed to some of the other ones on that list. I stuck one in here today, the Elon Musk one. That just came out yesterday, or earlier this week, will be the 19th of June. So, yeah, yesterday. Someone at Tesla, one of the many employees there, had an axe to grind and leaked a bunch of Tesla data to someone we don't know where, and we don't know who it was, and we don't know what data they've leaked. But these stories keep coming out at really big companies, and I don't think any of us really want to be the one in the news each day. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we can avoid that happening to us. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we can do that, avoid that happening to us in the age of data breaches, in the age of DevOps. So this is a bit about me. My name's Alex. I'm a consultant with DLM Consultants. I help people to adopt DevOps for their databases. That's primarily what I do. But I'm beginning to get quite interested in data protection. And there are a lot of interesting aspects of data protection, specifically related to DevOps, and what I'm really talking about is dev data. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We talk a lot about the production database and keeping the production database secure, but we don't really talk very much about how we're managing the security of our dev and our test and our staging databases. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Thank you for pointing out the MVP awards behind me. I'm very excited to be nominated as an MVP. That's in recognition of a bunch of the speaking I've done. I'm at over 100 speaker sessions now. Last year alone I did 44, I think, almost one a week, and it completely destroyed me. So I'm doing a few less this year. I'm also one of the organizers of SQL Relay. So if you're in the UK and you want some free SQL Server training, data platform training, then do check out sqlrelay.co.uk. We're going to be running 5 events this year in 5 days in Newcastle, Leeds, Birmingham, Reading, and Bristol. And we're just getting our agenda sorted for that, so that's really exciting. Also, I'm a big fan of the community, and as a conference organizer, I want to see more speakers come through. So a few months ago, I started a website called speakingmentors.com, and a whole bunch of people who are established speakers have said, look, I also care about seeing new talent come through, hearing new voices. So I'm willing to kind of give my time for free to anybody who wants some help getting on the speaker circuit. If you want some advice, if you want some coaching, if you want to look through a slide deck, then get in touch. Just go to speakingmentors.com. There are about 40, 50 different people on there now who have all said the same thing as me. So find a speaker that you admire, someone you think you would quite like to talk to, and they will give you their time for free to help you start speaking. So that's a bit about me. So let's talk about traditional database security. I posted a blog post earlier today, which was called Database Security Doesn't Protect the Data, because I think it protects systems, it doesn't protect data. A lot of the time it feels like when the sorts of things that we're doing for data protection, we're only overlooking at the production database. And a lot of the time that feels a bit like polishing the brass on the Titanic. The water's washing around our feet, but we're going to get the production database sorted and absolutely as secure as we can possibly get it. And we're forgetting about all of our other systems. And why is that important? Well, in any environment, we typically have development databases and we have production databases. And we spend a lot of time looking at the production databases, trying to get these guys nice and kind of do everything we can, scanning them for SQL injection vulnerabilities, making sure that the right people have access to the production data or don't have access to the production databases. But we forget dev databases. We forget our backups. And I'll tell you why that's important. The hackers aren't attacking production systems anymore. They're scanning the network for your dev databases and backups that are just lying around and forgotten about because it's easier. The guard is up on the production database. It's much easier to scan your system for dev databases. Yes, SQL injection is a thing, but what's a bigger risk is some developer clicking that phishing link and all of a sudden accidentally giving the bad guys access to their systems. And if the developer can see the data, now the hacker can see the data. So we need to be, when we're thinking about data security, we're not thinking about just a production database, we're thinking about all of the estate. And if you want me to put some numbers on that, this data comes from the IBM 27 cost of data breach study. Actually, believe it or not, slightly less than half of data breaches come from hacking. Most of it is from either a systems glitch or human error. It's humans in your organization and the mistakes that you make that are more likely to lead to a data breach than hackers. So spending all of our time thinking about the production database feels like we're missing, actually, it's probably more likely going to come from somewhere else. And here are a few examples of that. So the one in the middle is the one I mentioned at the beginning, Tesla. There was one of the developers had an axe to grind and decided to leak some data to unknown sources. We don't know what that was. We don't know who it was leaked to. But if Tesla has your data, I might be a little bit alarmed by that. The one on the left is River City Media. This is one of the largest hacks to date, I think. They're basically a spam bot company. They send spam emails, and they accidentally published a production backup to the public internet. And anybody could go to that URL and get access to the entire backup with 1.37 billion email records. So if you've been getting spam emails, probably your email address was in that breach. So that's not good news. That wasn't a production database that got hacked into. That was a mistake made with development data or a backup that was left in a silly place. The Uber one is interesting. Again, that was less than a year ago. some developers had some GitHub, some credentials to some storage on EC2, which had a bunch of user and rider data from Uber. The credentials to that were saved in a developer's GitHub repository. And exactly like I said, the hackers got in, they got access to the developer's machine. That was the attack vector. They got into the GitHub repo, they got the credentials, and then they're able to get all of that data. And Uber just seemed to have attack after attack. So that's kind of embarrassing. So all this is leading me, and when I'm talking about traditional security, what I'm talking about is kind of users, roles, even more modern stuff like row-level security, dynamic data masking, all this sort of stuff that we do in the production domain to say who can and who can't access the data. That's great, it's important. I'm not saying it's not important, but it kind of misses the point. It misses the point that that's actually not where the majority of data breaches come from. So if we go back to our development and dev database, we've got our DBAs and our security folks panicking about the production database. We should be putting up a wall, and we should understand where our boundary is, where the boundary of our security is, and anything outside that wall should not have sensitive data in it. Because as far as I'm concerned, from a security point of view, those development databases, those test databases, they are outside of the security perimeter because there are just too many people. Too many people have access to those development databases. You can't trust your developers. And that's not because they're not perfectly good people and smart people. They are. You may be one of the developers. But it's the same reason you take backups. And it's the same reason I wear a seatbelt. Okay? It's just, why take the risk? You don't have to. Why make your perimeter so much wider? Only a handful of people, the kind of DBAs that are looking after production, need access to the production database. All of your developers do not need access, should not be having access to your production databases because it's just too risky. And when I'm talking about the sensitive data should not live in dev, I'm going to propose to you that the measure of whether or not you've cleaned it up enough is this. Imagine your dev database is published to the web, and a link is posted on a popular hacker site. Did your heart skip a beat? If the answer is yes, probably have too much sensitive data in that database. If the answer is no, then great, it's only dev data, it's scratch data, it's not real data. That's what we want to be doing. That is how we're going to secure our estate. We're going to use what I call traditional security, user management and role management, and encryption and all of that stuff. We're going to use that in production. In development, we're just going to make sure the data doesn't exist there in the first place. Let's talk about DevOps. So when we're writing code, that might make life a bit more difficult for us. One of the challenges of writing software is, as a developer, I want realistic data. I want data that looks and feels like production data. Ideally, I want production data, because having the most accurate, realistic data that I can have is going to help me to write, to test my code effectively and write effective code. So there's this kind of contradiction here. As a developer, I want the most accurate, most realistic data I can have, because that's going to help me test code and write good code, and that actually is good for security. But at the same time, I'm not allowed to use sensitive data. So what are we going to do? And this, we need to have we can't let this wall that I'm putting up of security become a wall of confusion in a DevOps sense. I mean, a lot of the, like one of the memes in DevOps is this wall of confusion where the developers throw stuff over to the DBAs, and what kind of this meme is a classic example of that, where developer and operations don't work together. They absolutely should be working together. And the way that we can keep that security wall tight while supporting collaboration is to ensure that we provide developers with easy, automated, self-service ways to get hold of appropriate data for development and testing. It needs to be self-service because DBAs don't want to be hassle every single time a developer spins up a new database. And if we're going down the DevOps road, that probably means we're going to be doing things like branching and source controlling and spinning up new dev databases and test databases here and there, in kind of a self-service, kind of infrastructure as a service way. So we want to be able to easily spin up a database for testing purposes as we need it without bothering the DBA. That's going to help developers write good code, it's going to help them be more agile, and it's going to avoid the DBAs getting disturbed, because the DBAs probably worked to set up this process in the first place, and they automated it so they don't need to get bothered by it. Great.
Hey, Alex, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Would you be able to bring the mic closer to your mouth? We're hearing a lot of background noise from children playing.
I probably got the wrong mic set up. Let me see if I can change my audio settings.
Thanks so much. I'll stay on to confirm if we can still hear things.
Sure, my apologies. How do I do that and go to webinar?
If you expand out the audio tab on the GoToWebinar control panel, there is, you can choose, it has a little mic, and you can do a drop down that has USB audio device. Oh, that's what it says on mine. Sorry. You could do a drop down and select your audio device from there.
Audio. There we are.
Okay, is that better?
Oh yeah, totally different. This is your headset. Cool. Thank you so much.
Definitely much better.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, it was going through the webcam before rather than the headset. My apologies. Where are we? Okay, cool. So we want to have a self-service process to produce data that can be used for development purposes. Let's jump into an example, and let's start talking about a few different ways we can do that. Now, as an example, I recently started giving blood, and it was a horrible process. I hated it, but it's good for the world, so I carry on. And they asked for various information about me, and it's quite interesting. So they've got names and addresses, so that's obviously personally identifiable information that needs to be kept secret. They clearly have my blood type because they're grabbing blood from me, and they need to label it up, and they need to know what my blood type is. Now, blood type is interesting. Quite clearly, that's personal biometric data. So, based on pretty much any I'm not going to get too heavy into one law or another, but pretty much any data protection law is going to be pretty strict about kind of medical data like blood types. But the interesting thing about blood types is there are only, I'm not sure what the exact number is, but there are like a dozen or so of them. And everybody is one of those dozen or so different blood types. So if I was able to anonymize that data, and I could draw statistics about the total number of people in this country or in this region that have this blood type or that blood type, and that might be interesting for research. It might be interesting for tracking whether or not we're getting enough blood from the people with the right blood types. Maybe we might want to target marketing. Well, actually, targeted marketing sounds like a horrifically bad idea, but there might be interesting stuff that we can do with the blood type data once it's anonymized, and that's possibly perfectly fine from a data security point of view, because it's fully anonymized, and I don't think anyone's really going to care whether they find out that it's 12% or 11% of people in the UK are A positive or whatever. They also have some incredibly highly sensitive information about me. So to help you understand what sort of stuff they ask you for, this is the form that they asked me to fill in. I've taken the picture before I filled it in, so you can't see any of my answers. So, for example, they're asking about whether I've ever tested positive for HIV, whether I've been given money or drugs for sex. So these are really, really, really kind of very personal, sensitive things. They also have questions in here that are very likely to indicate sexual preference, which, again, that's a private matter, and we need to treat that data very, very carefully if we hold it. If I was the blood donor clinic, I need to think very, very carefully about how I hold that data, both in terms of the paper forms and in terms of the electronic version that's kept later. if they put it into a database. I don't know. I mean, that's sort of stuff that in some countries can have a very, very significant impact on your life. They also have stuff like this, so travel information. Now, I'm not that private about where I travel. I put out a tweet earlier today telling you what my travel schedule was going to be for the next few weeks. But this is the sort of stuff that may pose a re-identification risk. So if somebody knows what my travel itinerary has been for the last 6 weeks or so, then given that I do quite a lot of traveling, there's probably only a small number of people that have traveled to these different countries on these dates once you kind of add it all together. So that's, apart from the fact that it helps you put a real person in a real place at a point in time, which is specifically something that the GDPR, for example, legislates against. There's some really sensitive stuff there. So I'm going to use a blood donor clinic as a very basic case study, and I'm going to put together some pretend data that a blood clinic might have, and I'm going to mask it in a few different ways. Before we get onto that, I want to talk about the difference between my apologies. I want to talk about the difference between anonymization and pseudonymization, because there's a very important difference here. And it does have legal ramifications. And I said I don't want to get too deep into the legal stuff because we all live in different jurisdictions and different laws will apply to us. But this is probably quite important. So anonymization, and this is as defined by the GDPR. I apologize for those of you who aren't covered by the GDPR, although you probably are. But this is a pretty good description of anonymization. Information which does not relate to an identified or identifiable natural person, or to personal data rendered anonymous in such a manner that the data subject is no longer identifiable. So in the blood donor clinic example, if you just took the blood types and you took 1 million people's blood types and that's all the data that you had, then that's not identifiable at all. Because just because you know that 20% of people are A positive and 5% of people are O negative, I actually have got no idea what the percentages are. I'm not that's not what I do. So that was made up. But just because you know what the percentages are, that doesn't give you any more information about what my blood type is than what you would have had otherwise. So that can be considered completely anonymous, and under the GDPR, that falls out of GDPR. So critically, if you want to avoid GDPR regulations, one of the best things you can do is make sure your data is fully anonymized to the point that it can't be reattributed to a particular person. So let's contrast that with pseudonymization. And this is a word that's getting a lot of buzz at the moment, and it's been picked up as a big marketing word that a lot of companies are using to when they're selling products that claim to help you avoid GDPR. It's actually less strong than anonymization. So anonymization is better than pseudonymization. Pseudonymization is the processing of personal data in such a way that the data can no longer be attributed to a specific data subject. And this is the key bit, without the use of additional information. It's that additional information that's the key bit. As long as such additional information is kept separately and subject to technical and organizational measures to ensure non-attribution to an identifiable individual. So what it's saying is you can have a key, you can have some lookup over here. That might be an encryption key. That might be cross-referencing it with the primary keys in your production database. Anything, it might be a custom key that you have. I have worked with organizations, and I'm probably not allowed to say who they are or specify, so I won't, but their job is to make data available to different people. But different people have different access rights to the data. So what they do is they basically provide a key that allows them to have, they all get a standard version of the database, but different ones get like a different key that will enable them to understand what this bit of data is or what that bit of data is. So that's an example of pseudonymization. Now, the key thing for the GDPR is this phrase here, which comes straight out of the guide provided by the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. So these are the people in the UK who are responsible for enforcing the GDPR. And before anybody starts talking about Brexit to me, the UK, one of the first things that happened with Brexit is they basically carbon copied the GDPR into UK law. Now, there are some complicated discussions about, well, what happens if the EU want to change it and we don't, and so there are some discussions to be had there, but the UK has carbon copied basically the GDPR into UK law so that we're working to exactly the same standard. So this is what they've said. They said personal data that has been pseudonymized, for example, key-coded, can fall within the scope of the GDPR depending on how difficult it is to attribute the pseudonym to a particular individual. Now, I've heard varying levels of varying versions of this. Some versions that say pseudonymization always comes within the GDPR, and some versions that say, well, it's kind of about the level of risk. If you can say that it's pseudonymized and you've got incredible controls over it, and you can say with a huge amount of certainty that it's never ever going to be breached, then fine. That's a dangerous line to take, saying that whatever it is, your data is never going to be breached. So I guess the point I'm making here is pseudonymization is a bit grey and open to interpretation, which is a bit scary. It's also not the only way that you can be re-identified. So whether or not you've tried anonymization or pseudonymization, you do need to be careful about the re-identification risk. Now, there's a famous story a while ago, back when Yahoo was a search engine that people used, where I think it was Yahoo, it might have been Google. I apologize, I'm going to need to Google for references on this one. But they basically published a bunch of search terms from 100 or so users of Yahoo or Google or whatever the search engine was. And this got a big uproar because that's a huge invasion of privacy. Just publishing without asking permission, just publishing the terms that you've been searching for. And they claimed that, well, these are random, it's randomized, you don't know who it is, it's anonymized data. And a researcher managed to prove them wrong, because it turned out that one of the people was Googling or Yahooing or whatever the term should be for a generic search engine. They were looking for information to do with a very rare disease and information associated with their small local town. And once you knew that it was somebody likely to be interested in this rare disease and this small town, the researcher was able to actually, through publicly available information, identify exactly who the person was. So we need to be thinking about stuff like that. If I've anonymized my first name and my last name, for example, you should be aware that in the US, I think it's if you take somebody's gender, their birthday, and their zip code, those three things together are, in almost all cases, enough to identify the person from publicly available data. So we need to think very carefully about re-identification as well when we're masking data. So I've prepared a sample set of data here. I hope, Bill, Chrissy, I hope you don't mind. Obviously these blood types are completely made up. So I've got no idea what blood types Chrissy and Bill have, and I'm certainly not J negative. I figured the Twitter handles were fair game, because I figured that you guys probably already knew our Twitter handles. So this is my pretend blood donor data. And so let's talk about ways that we could anonymize this or pseudonymize it, and then let's talk about some technical implementations of that. So would we argue that this is anonymized or pseudonymized? I should have thought ahead and done a poll. I didn't realize I could do that on GoToMeeting. I should have planned in advance and got some sort of voting system going on. Do you think this is anonymized data or pseudonymized data? I was personally quite chuffed with my Twitter handles that I came up with. I spent far too much time preparing this presentation, working out good Twitter handles for these folks. I would argue that this is pseudonymized data because we haven't changed our primary keys. The primary key remains the same. And to explain why that might be significant, what if in the future I was to make this data available to somebody else? I might argue that that data is reasonably public data. There's nothing particularly there that's sensitive, except for the fact that if you had access to both pieces of data and you've not changed the IDs, well, all of a sudden I can learn that SQL Werewolf is an X neutral just by comparing on the ID field. So we do need to be careful about primary keys. So in this example, I would probably say this is fully anonymized data. I have shuffled up the IDs. I've put random IDs in there, and that's going to make life a challenge. I've put random names in there. I have made them gender specific because that may have consequences on the behavior of my system, for example. But that's getting into a whole nother minefield, which I'm not going to go into. Cool, so this is great. This would be reasonably nice data to work with as a developer, for example. As a developer, this looks realistic data. It's good enough for me to understand, to test my code out, to make sure the stuff works. I've even got vague associations between the names and the Twitter handles, so that's quite nice. So now how would I think about doing this for billions and billions of records? Well, clearly, and I spent a good 10 or 15 minutes working out nice, handy Twitter handles for these fake names, and I'm not going to be able to do that over 20 billion rows in a massive database table. So what am I going to do about that? There's another, sorry, I forgot I'd added that slide in. One option is just to remove the primary keys, although that's likely to have an impact on my development system. Another option is just to blat out the data entirely. That's another good way of handling things. It depends on what you need your data for, right? So if it's just for analytics or something, then we might want to think about how we prepare that data and which data we provide and which data we don't provide, and making sure we're only providing the data that's necessary. We could try encrypting it, but then is that anonymized or pseudonymized? Well, what happens to the key? If somebody gets hold of that encryption key, they can unlock your data. So that probably is so encrypted data is probably pseudonymized data, unless you can make a very strong argument to the authorities that your encryption key is safe, and that's probably a dangerous argument. That's probably a dangerous way to go. So the inspiration for this talk was this tweet that I put out a couple of months ago, and a few people responded to it saying they wanted a blog post, and so I submitted a conference to a session. One person said he wanted a song, so we argued for a bit about the appropriate song that I should write, and I came up with a Metallica song, sang to the tune to Enter Sandman.
You're my hero.
Thank you. So that may or may not happen at a future event. I think I might need to, I don't know if you've seen any of my previous videos, but I'm going to need to do a lot of practice at the guitar before I rock out with any Metallica at any events anytime soon.
I put Seek and Destroy in mine, so.
So these are the types of data that we can probably think about using. Now, first of all, production data, that is very much dependent on the data that you hold. If you hold sensitive data that is either legally or ethically should be protected, then production data is something that we probably are going to rule out. Obviously, if your data is not sensitive, personally identifiable, then go wild, stick production data in dev. I don't care. But if it is sensitive in any way, then we're probably going to rule that one out. The next option is no data. The easiest way to protect the data is just strip it out entirely and say developers don't get data. Well, probably not. That is a surefire way for your developers to write crappy code that works in dev, that doesn't scale when you have to large systems. When it worked when my table had 3 rows of data in it, but what about when my data had 1 million rows of data in it? Suddenly that cursor that felt like a really good idea at the time isn't really going to work in production. So no data is probably also not really an option. So for most of us, that leaves us with 3: generated data, curated data, and masked data. So let's talk about this. So let's jump into, I've got a, where's my VMware? Here we are. Let me grab that, bring it up here, and go full screen. So there are many tools that are available. I will be honest, this talk was written and put together at very, very short notice. So the tools I use were the ones I know best, which happen to be the Redgate tools. And I know I have a reputation for talking about Redgate tools all the time. I'm planning the next time I do this to use the Visual Studio tools for this section, but I put this talk together in a bit of a rush, so I apologize. So I'm going to use the Redgate tool, SQL Data Generator, in this example. So I have created a blood donors database, which has some predictable data in there. Select top 1,000 rows. It's some data that you've seen before. If it is going to run. Here we go. I'm assuming you're watching over the webcam, which means I'm assuming that you can have a nice big view of the screen and I don't need to be using Zoom It or anything. If you want me to use Zoom It, I can, but given we're doing this over GoToMeeting, I'm assuming you don't want me to. If that's a bad assumption, then holler, let me know somehow.
It looks good from here, Alex.
Cool, fantastic. So here's the data that that I used in my slide, and I want to anonymize that in some way. So I can use, so what Redgate SQL Data Generator is going to do, and there's a similar tool in Visual Studio which you don't have to pay for. I just don't know it as well, which is why when I was in a hurry I used this one. I point at my database, and I can point to my tables, and okay, this is a dummy database. It has 1 table with 3 rows in it, but bear with me. It can take a look at the columns in my database, and it's going to make sensible suggestions about what sort of data I want to stick in there. So I've got a full names column here, for example, Twitter handles. I've just created a very basic regex to give me something very, very basic that looks a little bit like a Twitter handle. And blood type I've created, let me make that a bit larger. Again, I've used the regex generator to generate something that looks a little bit like a made up dummy blood type. So if I was to, I can save this project and I can run this to generate my data. This can run with a function to either delete the data first and respawn it, or I can just run it on an empty database and just stick some dummy data in there, or I can append to existing data. But given the point is we want to anonymize the data, we probably want to make sure we've cleared out all the data before we start going. So I can generate that data. In this case, I specified I only wanted 3 rows, but I could specify I want a zillion rows, or I just want it to run for 2 hours and see how many it gets me. A zillion was probably a fairly silly large number to pick. Oops. We have a blood donors curated data database that I use for this, and I failed to show you the before version because I made a mistake. So I can't prove that this was the original data before, but I promise you before I ran that, we did have the original data in there. And after, oh, we still have the original data. Is there an OK button or something that I need to, it says it ran. Why did it not run? Ah, that's because I'm in the wrong one. That's curated data. Generated data, that's where I should be looking. So that's taken my, or it will have shortly. So that's taking my real data and it's providing me with dummy data. Now, problems with this data, it's very, very basic. It's got the genders wrong. If gender was important to me, then it's turned, we did have male, female, male, and now we have female, male, male. Well, I guess Lee could be a male or a female, but so it's not got the gender right, so that's a bit annoying. The Twitter handles, they look a bit ridiculous. So I probably could have done a better job of coming up with a realistic Twitter handle if I'd put a bit of effort into it. But out of the box, it looks a bit basic. Blood types, that looks fairly realistic. I need to work on my regex skills to improve the code that I generated to make that all look about right. But that kind of works okay. One of the nice things about generated data is if you just open up something like Data Generator, it will come up with a whole bunch of basic default settings that are in some cases probably very simplistic and not particularly realistic looking, but it will give you something very, very quickly. So it's probably quite quick and easy to get started with this data, even if it is pretty basic. So that's generated data. That's one option that we have. Another option is what I call curated data. So this is data that I have written, and typically I've written it because I want to test various edge case scenarios. So what happens when I have an empty string? What happens when I have a 0 value? What happens when I have a negative number or a massive number? What happens if somebody has inserted, what happens with dirty data? One of the problems with generated data is it all looks very, very neat and formulaic. And actually the real data in our systems probably isn't. The real data is probably fairly dirty. And so if I'm going to create software that works, I want it to look like real data, because it's all of that ugly data that causes problems. So I need to be, when I'm writing my code, I want to be writing defensively to handle all of those scenarios, to make sure that whatever I expect to happen when I have dirty data happens. So let's look at how I've implemented that. So, oh, wrong one, wrong VM. That's my backup VM. So I have a curated data table here, and this is, again, I've got the original data in here when Management Studio catches up. So I've got my original data in here. What I also have added is a stored procedure. Now, there are various different ways you can do this. I quite like doing it in a stored procedure because it makes it really, really easy then to add this to source control. And if I take a look at this stored procedure, this is what it does. It truncates the data in that table and it replaces it with some data that I have provided, data that I have chosen. So this is kind of the example that I gave in my slides. I am providing specific cases of data. So I've got my Luke Skywalker, my Leia Organa, and my Han Solo specifically in there. So what I can do is I can just execute the stored procedure. Execute stored procedure. I should have just done this in code. Okay, off we go. And when we take a look now, we have the new data with bogus IDs, bogus people, but we could keep the original data if we wanted to. So it allows us to basically completely hand crank how we do this. In this case, I put in a particular set of cases. So that's a very manual and laborious way of doing things, but it does allow you to ensure that you have particular test cases in your database. So I've worked so one of the companies I worked for, their unit tests in their application code were based on an assumption that certain test cases existed in the database. Now, the real reason for that is because I won't say who they were and I won't say why they did this, but back when data privacy wasn't as big a concern as it is today, they used to take production data and they knew that there was a particular user that had this number of credits, for example, in their development database. So they always use that one to test out what happens in this edge case scenario. It was a gambling company, and various logic might change when you go from 999,999 credits to 1 million credits. You might have slightly different behavior happen in various games, so you want to make sure that that happens, for example. Now, probably a better way to do that would be to have that handled in your unit tests. So I hope you're using T-SQL-T or some other unit testing framework, and you've got automated tests going on for all of your stored procedures and functions and things. So they get started with a, I apologize, it's a bit windy here today and I've got the window open because it's also quite hot. And so the door behind me keeps, I had wedged one of my banners from trade shows up against the door, but it seems that it's not strong enough.
It's not really distracting. I do have a question for you, Alex. Whenever you talk about this data, are you talking about a scenario where a production database is moved to a development environment or given to developers? Is there a difference?
That's a very good question. Should
the approach be different for both of them?
That's probably something that, that's probably a few slides there that I should include in this presentation. Like I said, this is the first time I've delivered this talk, so any feedback that you have afterwards, please do send it my way so that I can improve and iterate for the next time I do it, which I believe will be SQL Saturday Manchester for those of you in the UK. Yeah, so probably what I would do is I would have a process where it depends on the approach I'm taking. So if I was using a generated data approach, I would probably provide an empty database, just create it from source control, and then squirt your data in using SQL Data Generator, or an equivalent tool. Many tools are available. If I was taking this approach, I could do the same thing. I could have a empty database and I could just run the stored procedures that are in source control that will squirt my data in. You may prefer to do it as a post-deployment script, or you might prefer just to have some basic SQL scripts in source control alongside your application code that will squirt in some test data for you. So when you initially provision an empty database and then you squirt in the test data. Now, one of the problems with that approach is it doesn't scale very well. Trying to do this for large sets of data isn't great. The next approach is data masking, which is probably the best way to have a realistic set of data of a production scale or thereabouts. But it is more difficult and it does have more complicated issues. And in that scenario, we are talking probably about taking production data, cleaning it up with some masking process, and then once it's cleaned up, making that available to your developers. So that probably happens on the production side of your firewall. If we think of our ring of security, all of the preparation of the data needs to happen on the production side of the fence, because we need to make sure that that doesn't, because that involves the actual data, and the actual data should not leave the production domain until it's been cleaned up.
Does that mean that there's an assumption that the developer domain is less secure than the production domain? Or is it just because the mere existence of the data in two places is problematic?
It is an assumption that your development domain is fundamentally less secure because your developers have access to it. And in most scenarios, on the assumption that you have a smallish number of DBAs and a larger number of developers, who may be .NET developers, they might not even be database developers, or something else. Typically, the production database is, I mean, there are many traditional talks on database security which will tell you how to manage your users and your roles and all the stuff I was talking about at the beginning, which is important, absolutely is important. But there's also the development domain, which is far less controlled. And it involves copying data all over the place and not tracking it and leaving dusty old backups in places and forgetting about them. And then some hacker comes and sniffs your network and gets access to an old backup from 3 years ago that still has some pretty sensitive data on it.
I see. That goes back to your point that you were making earlier. It was either here or on Twitter where you said that people generally don't really go for the production domains. They're going for the development domains because of this very reason. It's not very clean, and potentially your developers are introducing additional vulnerabilities. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I do have a question from the audience. Do you have a moment?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure, go ahead.
All right, so Bill Walter
asked. What time do you want me to finish?
That's actually up to Bill. Bill, I'm new to being co-organizer of this. I know that in general there are we in the PowerShell user group we did it for 1 hour. I don't know about Bill's structure. Are you there, Bill?
Yeah, I'm here.
Werewolf.
I'm here.
Is there a time limit on this particular meeting?
It's usually an hour, but it is virtual, so we can go a little bit over. Most people are doing this from work, I'm guessing, or many are. So
totally.
We don't want to go too far over.
I think that this question, just real quick, Alex, will be quick to answer, and I'm also interested in the answer. So Bill Walter asks, when you change the IDs in your blood type table, how do you handle references to that table from other related tables that use the ID as a foreign key reference?
So that relies on having a good idea of your dependencies. So do you have any sort of dependency tracking tool? Do you have any sort of documentation of that sort of stuff? It's difficult, but it is basically a case of understanding where your dependencies are. And I'm about to go into data masker. I'm probably not going to have enough time to do that demo. But I can probably share some documentation afterwards that will explain kind of the process that you go through to kind of keep track of those and make sure everything gets updated in the correct way. I'm not going to have time to kind of go through a full demo of that during this presentation, but I think it's primarily a case of just understanding your dependencies and using dependency tracking tools and things to figure that out. I don't know if you have anything more to add.
Do you have any dependency tracking tools that you favor?
The ones I know are the ones that you might predictably say that I know, and I'm trying to avoid plugging Redgate all the time because I know I have a bad reputation for it. Redgate has a pretty decent dependency tracking tool called SQL Dependency Tracker, and I've not used any others, so I can't really speak for them. Would I recommend it over the others? I'll say I've used it personally and it's worked for me, and I've not used the others, so I can't really vouch for them.
Thank you.
Cool. So we said an hour, and it is on the hour mark. So I would.
How much more do you think you have? So what I'd like to say is, if you have a bit more and people would like to stay, that's great. We can keep going. I can stay on for a bit, so it's up to you.
I have about. I was just going to talk a little bit about mass data, and then that was going to be the end. So I am kind of 5 minutes from the end.
Okay,
So that's totally fine. Yeah.
that works for me. Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. And on this one, I do need to revert to a different VM snapshot because I did not have time to get this one set up before the talk. I was a bit frantic before this talk trying to get everything up and running. So I'm just going to revert to a different VM snapshot where I have a pre-canned demo using a different demo scenario. So I apologize that it doesn't quite all join up at the end. I had 1 or 2 last-minute issues putting together the demo based on the blood donor example. I probably should have done this while we're already talking. In the meantime, are there any more questions while we just wait for this to go through? Well, perhaps while we wait for this to go through, I'll jump in.
Go ahead.
Slides. So mask data, the point here is we're going to take the production data and we're going to apply masking rules to it so that we are basically covering up and hiding the sensitive bits of data. And what that means is I do get production data, it's just the bits that I don't want you to see, the sensitive bits, are masked. Now, this does rely on having a pretty good data catalog because there's a risk here that you might miss something. And data catalogs are also something that, as an industry, we probably haven't invested enough time in, but it's becoming increasingly important now. If you are governed by GDPR, then GDPR explicitly states that one of the first things that you need to do is to have a data audit and kind of log where all your data is and the sensitivity of all of that data, and that you should have some sort of data policy, data protection policy that describes how different classifications of data will be treated and secured. So a really great practice is to have some sort of data dictionary, some sort of documentation of what data you have in what place and how it's classified with respect to data privacy, so is it sensitive or not. There's some really cool functionality in Management Studio 17.5 upwards that allows you just to right-click on databases and classify it, and it will add extended properties to your databases and so on. Let's see, which version of Management Studio do I have here? I think it will be included in this release. I'm probably on 17.4 because I've got the scan for vulnerabilities, but I don't have the classify column, so I probably need to update my Management Studio. So it allows you to go through and classify the various different columns. I'm sorry I didn't have time to do that demo in this workshop, in this demo. And then once you've got your kind of classification of, right, here are all your sensitive columns, that basically gives you a hit list of all the different things that you need to go and mask to make sure that they are not, all of the sensitive data is hidden away. And then once you have that, you can, behind the production firewall, behind the security perimeter, you can create a staging copy, clean up all the data, and then you can make that data available either just by backup restore, stick a backup somewhere on a server, or if you're worried about disk space, use some sort of virtualization technique like a cloning tool like comes with Windocs or Redgate, and then you can make it easy to provision that data nice and quickly. So I'm going to show you Redgate SQL Data Masker here. In this example, I have a kitten trainers column, kitten trainers database, and there's a foreign key in this to a cities database. So I have names of various kitten trainers in my database, and I have a foreign key to a city which that kitten trainer lives in. And for reference, all these numbers are bogus. I'm not using the real data here. So that goes to a bunch of cities there. So How could I anonymize that data? Well, I've got a data masking project here, and what this does is it sets up a bunch of masking rules that I can run one by one. So for example, I can create a new rule, a substitution rule, for example. And the first thing I'm going to do is take those full names. So I'm going to grab the kitten trainers full name column, and I'm going to replace the existing data with names. Names are the first names first and last, male and female. If I wanted to, if I had a gender column, I would be able, you can use where clauses here as well. So you could set up gendered names based on the gender column, if that may be important to you. So you can create that substitution rule. And what I can also do is these cities, I could either just squirt random numbers in, or what I might do, because I want to keep the rough distribution the same, I want to have kind of the majority of people in London, because these are all UK people, and most of the UK, the distribution is skewed towards London in the UK of addresses. So let's, what I'm going to do there is I'm going to add a new rule, which is going to be a shuffle rule. Now again, we need to think a bit about our re-identification risk here. So I want to shuffle the city column in the kitten trainers table. We do need to think a little bit about our re-identification risk here. With small numbers and small sample sizes, shuffling might not be a particularly strong way of hiding information. So for example, if you were to shuffle the salaries of the people at your organization, it is likely that the CEOs and the directors are going to be the 2 or 3 people at the top with by far the highest salary. So you can tend to re-identify people that way. In this case, let's imagine I had a slightly bigger list. It's probably a reasonable way, given that I've got a fairly good distribution here. But you need to have a little bit of a think about that for yourself. I can then run that masking set. And once that's run, it shouldn't take very long because it's not a particularly big table. There are only about 20 or so people in this table. That's complete. Once that's run, I can refresh this and I should see random names and the cities have all been shuffled up.
So
in
Alex,
summary,
I'm sorry. So Alex, just to be clear, you are using the Redgate tool there? That's what you were using?
so Redgate data, that was a data masking tool. Other tools are available.
Okay. Well, yes, other tools are available, but Redgate is our sponsor for this virtual user group. So
I didn't realize that. In that case, call it a sponsor session. Yes, it's a great tool. Go use it. It also plugs in really well with SQL Clone, which is a virtualization automated provisioning tool, and which aligns with the self-service stuff that I was talking about earlier on.
That's perfect. I just wanted to let you know that Redgate is our sponsor, so it's not a bad thing to plug them. So it works right. It works right into your skill set.
Sure thing. Fantastic. So this is kind of just to summarize. This is my very quick summary table that I stuck at the end. Generated data is relatively easy to spin up. There are tools that are available in Visual Studio or through Redgate, or probably others are available, where you can just basically click a button and it's going to squirt data into a database. It's not really going to look at the data that's already there, and it's not really going to be that realistic. And it's not going to be as dirty as your real data, probably, unless you put a fair amount of time in fine-tuning it. But it does allow you to get started with some dev data pretty quickly. Curated data allows you to put in the kind of custom test cases and things that you want, and it allows you to source control those and make sure that you always have the same data every single time, which is great. But it does take a fair amount of time to set up, and it's not going to scale very well. Unless you start writing your own generation algorithms to start generating data, in which case just use you're kind of verging towards generated data anyway. And then finally, mass data takes production as the source, and then it kind of takes a fine-tooth comb and masks this column or that column appropriately, replacing the important bits of credit card numbers with X's, or squirting in random names, or using regexes or Python scripts or something to replace the data in a way that keeps it as true as possible to the production data. So it's probably as close as you're going to get to production data, but you do need to be very careful you don't miss anything, because otherwise that's potentially a data breach, especially if, so under GDPR, I keep coming back to GDPR because I'm European and it's been drilled into me for the last few months. But under GDPR, for example, consent is really important. And all of those data subjects in your database may well have given you consent to send them emails or deliver some service, but I'm pretty sure they didn't consent to you using their data in dev and test systems for development and test purposes. So from a consent point of view, that data is not allowed to go into the dev domain unless they've explicitly opted into that, which I'm pretty sure they haven't. And with that in mind, technically, it could get classed as a data breach if you were to put that data into the dev domain, which technically means you should be reporting it to the authorities. Whether or not the authorities are going to come down in that level of detail is yet to be seen, and I don't know any more than you do. But technically, if you take a very strict reading of it, then yeah, they probably could. So that's kind of all I have for you. I've not yet written the website dlmconsultants.com/devdata, but I will write it at some point in the next couple of weeks before I do this session again, and I'll post all of my references up there. If you want to contact me or have any questions about this talk, you've got my email address and my Twitter handle there. And that's all I have for you. I would be particularly interested in any feedback you have about this session. I'll say this is the first time I've delivered it, and I was putting the finishing touches to it kind of in the minutes before this meeting, so I do apologize for being not having a huge amount of prep time, but I blame Bill for that because he only asked me to present a couple of days ago, and he did choose one of the presentations, and I said I haven't actually written yet.
Well, I just wanted to present you with a challenge, Alex, and I feel you did it. I feel you did very, very well rising to the challenge. So we have no more questions, but before all the remaining attendees go, since Redgate is our sponsor, if you could do me a favor, Alex, out of the 13 remaining attendees, somebody gets to win a $100 gift card. Do you have a way that I can't do it because, you know, it could be people on here at work for me, so I don't want to seem biased. So if you could figure out maybe a way either by number or something like that we could figure out a winner.
Let's see if this works. How many people did we say we have?
13.
13.
Okay.
I think about no, generate. 4. I think the first one was just the biggest number, so number 4. So who's the fourth person in the list?
Number 4 is Irene Daniel. So Irene, if you could, and this person's from Clear Channel, so if you could email devops@pass.org, I will get you set up with that gift card. And thank you so very much, Alex. It was very, very, very informative. I very much appreciate it. And I know next month, for anybody that's still here, we're going to have Hiram on here. He hasn't decided what session he's going to do, but we have him. Then we'll have Steve Jones, not Steve West. And we'll keep pushing. We're going to keep having some more speakers come up, and heck, we'll have Alex again for sure, I hope. So.
I'll be happy to come back if you'll have me back.
All right. Thank you guys very much, and you all have a great day.
Thanks very much, guys. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.